Hello, and welcome to today's live webinar on how to help your students become better critical thinkers in introductory accounting courses. I'm Steve Matsky, Director of Faculty and University Initiatives at the AICPA, and I would like to thank you for joining this second in a three-part webinar series that delves into the new AICPA Faculty Guide on Critical Thinking. Before I introduce our panelists today, I'd just like to say a couple of words. First, I would like to extend a sincere thanks to all of you who attended the first web event. We're glad that so many of you got so much out of it. The feedback has been tremendous, and we very much appreciate that. I'd also like to thank those of you who were able to join us, Susan, for her session at the American Accounting Association's annual meeting. That has been archived. We don't know when that can be played back, but we hope that you watch for the announcements from the AAA and go watch that series. For those of you that are attending today, this is being recorded, and you will be sent the slides and a link to the recording. And I would like to ask that we would also include a link to the previous recording for those of you who were unable to join the first session and would like to see how this entire process flows. So please do that. For housekeeping items, I'd like to remind those of you that are seeking the CPE credits today to make sure that you answer the polling questions, all of the polling questions, so that you can get the CPE, and that this will be an interactive session. So I will be monitoring the Q&A and the chat features along with my colleague Ann Monroe as well, and we will be more than happy to pose your questions to the panelists as they proceed on this excellent web event. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists today. First, I'd like to introduce you to Susan Wolcott. Many of you know Susan. Susan is a true, what do I call you, Susan? The guru. For over 30 years, Susan has been a leading researcher in cognitive development and critical thinking. She's a co-founder of the firm Wolcott Lynch. She's a textbook author. She has received her PhD and her master's in accounting and information systems at Northwestern University. She has taught extensively at universities around the world, has consulted with many, and we're so thankful that she's here. Prior to joining the Academy, she spent 10 years in public accounting. It is my true honor also to introduce you to Deanna Foster. Deanna is an assistant professor of accounting at Nichols College in Dudley, Massachusetts. For those of you that joined the first web event, she was in the audience just like you. We couldn't be more proud to have her join us on this, as she's going on this journey to see what this critical thinking work is all about. Deanna has over 10 years of experience in banking, external audit, and government and nonprofit accounting. We really genuinely appreciate all the work that she has put into preparing for this web event and all of the great things she's going to share with you. We are on a journey together, and today, together, Susan and Deanna are going to be helping you understand the process of developing learning activities using the critical thinking model that Susan has developed. So thank you so much for joining us today, Susan and Deanna. We look forward to a great event.
Thank you, Steve. I'm looking forward to today's workshop. Let me just start by kind of providing a very brief overview of what we're hoping to achieve today. For those of you who attended the previous workshops, we're only going to do just a very quick overview of the stages of cognitive development, because we want to spend more of our time today talking about examples of learning activities, and Deanna is going to share several with you, and I will share a few with you. So we're going to focus today on the introductory accounting courses, which means that the learning activities we will focus on are at the early stages of cognitive development, stages 1 and 2. And we're hoping to give plenty of time at the end to have more discussion and questions and so on. So I'm going to start with just a really quick overview of these stages. And if you've attended one of the previous webinars, you've already seen this. So the first stage for adult cognitive development is what I have called stage 1. And my name for this is the confused fact finder. And the idea here is that one of the the students at stage 1 believe that there's only a single correct answer to every possible question we would give them. And because of that, the student thinks that that's their entire task. And so they spend a lot of time looking in their textbook and in their class notes, and they want to replicate what the experts have told them. They don't really understand that they need to use their own judgment. Just for your information, there's a polling question up right now. So I want to make sure you all respond to that polling question. So once a student has learned that they have to actually use their own judgment, because not all problems have single correct answers that can be memorized, then they can move to what I call stage 2, the biased jumper. And as I said before, these first 2 stages are the most common that we see in introductory accounting courses. So these are the 2 we want to focus on here. And the bias jumper actually has some critical thinking skills. They recognize that there are problems that require their judgment, that require their own conclusions, and that's good up to that point. However, they have rather superficial critical thinking abilities. They tend to start by picking what they think their opinion is on a problem, and then they stack up arguments and evidence to support that. So they don't really do critical thinking in the way that we think about it, which is starting by trying to understand the problem and then analyzing and then reaching a conclusion. They do it the other way around, and that's why I call this stage the bias jumper. The third stage is the perpetual analyzer, and we won't really be talking about this one today, so I'm going to kind of skip past that to the 4th stage, the pragmatic performer. And stage 4 is really what we're looking for in our entry-level accountants. And so this is what the employers are wanting. But unfortunately, most college students in the US and what little research there's been done in accounting tends to agree with the kind of broader higher education literature, is that most undergraduates complete their undergraduate degree at stage 2. A small number at stages 3 and 4, primarily stage 2. And unfortunately, in our introductory accounting courses, we have a lot of students at stage 1. And I would be willing to guess that depending on your institution and the nature of your students, it's very likely that most of your students in an introductory course are at stage 1, with maybe a bigger chunk, a smaller chunk at stage 2. So we're going to focus on those 2 stages today for the introductory accounting courses. And in general, our goal is to help students develop critical thinking skills more quickly than we typically see. In other words, we don't want them to graduate at stage 2. We want them to graduate at stage 4. The question is, how can we make that happen? So we kind of have 3 general recommendations, and one is to use some kind of critical thinking model with your students. And we're going to come back and talk about this model a little bit more shortly. And then the second thing is we need to give students feedback that's going to help them move to the next stage. And I should just comment, there's a second polling question up right now, so please respond to that, and if you need or would like to have the CPE credit. And one of my recommendations, and something that we're going to talk about in more detail today, is how do we use a rubric to give our students useful feedback for critical thinking. And then the third major recommendation is that we need to actually think about how we're designing our course and our learning activities so that we infuse the teaching of technical material with critical thinking. And we're going to provide you with explicit examples of that. So before I turn the speaker over to Deanna, let me just briefly outline. If you have students at stage 1, this slide kind of summarizes overall what we would like our students to be able to do. At the top, these are kind of the learning objectives. Remember, the students at stage 1 believe that there's a single correct answer to everything. And that's because they actually don't understand that ambiguities and uncertainties prevent single correct answers to many, many questions and many problems in the business world. And so that's the number one learning objective for students at stage one. They need to understand that the world's messy. And in turn, that leads to the validity of multiple perspectives, because if we don't know the single correct answer, that means that different people can legitimately hold different opinions. And then finally, we want them to learn some very basic rules about how to form their own conclusion and start providing some evidence, but that's going to be at a very basic level. I'm going to comment here briefly on the results of the last polling question, and I see that 73% of you said that you think your students are operating a confused fact finder, and that's pretty consistent with what I've seen teaching introductory accounting courses, and another roughly 23% at the bias jumper, with a very small group at the higher stages. So this is completely consistent with all of the evidence that I've seen and with my own assessments in my own classrooms. So what we want to be able to do here is we want to be able to kind of first recognize where are our students. And that's why starting with that question is an important one. And then if we think most of our students are at stage one, then we want to build learning activities into our classroom that are going to address these large learning objectives. And down here at the bottom of this slide, I've put some information in from the Pathways vision model. I assume everyone has seen that before. And I think the Pathways vision model is wonderful, but sometimes I think it's easy to get carried away and give our students in early classes tasks that are too complicated. So here are some recommendations for how you kind of apply the ideas in the Pathways vision model at an appropriate level for those introductory students. Keep the events and circumstances fairly straightforward with just a small number of uncertainties, and a small number of judgments, so that they can kind of students can get their hands around it. And then keep in mind over here on the left, keep in mind that until the students recognize uncertainties, they will not be able to really make progress on the next two learning objectives. So our biggest goal with students at stage one is to help them recognize uncertainties. So now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Deanna.
Thank you, Susan. So one of the things I wanted to do today is just chat with you about what I plan to do on my first day of classes. And lucky for us, my first day of classes are tomorrow. So what I'm going to do is go over the syllabus and then probably do some icebreakers. I also do a schedule where I go over assignments, when exams will be issued. And then I plan to go over this critical thinking model. And I think this is something that students can definitely go back and reference when they're doing assignments and homework. So it's broken out into 3 steps. So I think with identifying, the students will be able to identify problems and relevant information. With analyze, they'll be able to apply knowledge. And then concluding, they'll be able to make decisions and basically issue advice in their assignments. So another thing that I wanted to discuss is one of the reasons why I started going through this process with Susan after the first seminar. So I noticed that many of my students were not giving me the responses that I wanted on exam questions, homework, even case studies. And I realized it was not the students, it was actually me. So I realized one of my problems was that my questions were too vague and too broad. So the students did not know what type of information to give back to me in response. So also in my introduction courses, I tend to focus a lot on practice problems, doing repetitive practice and building those skills. So going through this process and changing a lot of my assignments really took me out of my comfort zone. So I had to get creative. I had to really work on the questions I was going to ask students and making those adjustments. So one of the things that I wanted to go over with you next is going to be a ratio example. That's one of the first assignments that I adjusted. And going through this process, this was the hardest one I had to go through, this first example. But once I went through the first example, I really got the hang of it, and then it ended up being okay. So I realized that what I have to do is think of the ideal response or the ideal submission that I would want from my students. And then once I have that, I can then just break it down into more simplified questions. So I'm actually guiding my students to think more critically. So with what I'm going to do next is go through the ratio example. So, and again, this is just an example of stage 1 students. So as I mentioned before, I really focused on, repetition and getting those basic skill sets down for introductory to financial accounting. So this is a question that I asked on one of my exams, and it's just asking students for current ratios. So what I've done is I have 2 organizations, Fred and Fern, and then I have the current year and prior year information, and then obviously net income, net sales, current assets, and current liabilities. So for part A of this problem, the students just had to calculate the current ratio for each year, so current year and prior year for each one of the companies. So basic calculations there. Then for part B, I asked students who has the better ability to pay short-term obligations. And I then ask them to explain that, and I usually get very vague responses, usually something along the lines of Fern because they have a higher ratio and then they can't explain it. So very vague. Then part C, how do each of the companies compare to the industry average? And again, very similar to part B, vague responses. I usually get, Fred's below the average and Fern is above with no true explanations. So what I tried to do with this problem is think of the actual information that I want to see from students, and then I just broke it out more to kind of guide the students along. So in the revised version for stage 1, I just included the company Fern. So just simplified it a little bit more. I included the current year and the prior year, and then the same information. So you have your net income, net sales, current assets, and current liabilities. So for the first part of the problem, what the students have to do is actually tell me what the current ratio is and why it's relevant. So tell me why they're using it. For part B, actually I misspoke. A is to make the calculation, so just the basic calculation again, and then B is to explain why current ratio can be a useful metric. So why is it relevant in industry perhaps? And then for part C, where I'm asking students, who has a great ability or a better ability to pay short-term debt. I've given them the current ratio for their competitor, so that's given to them. And then I've also asked them what it means when the current ratio is close to 1. So the student can kind of think about, if the ratio is close to 1, they don't have as much current assets and they may have some difficulties paying off some of that debt. So it kind of leads them to that response for the second part of the question, who has the better ability to pay? And then we have part D. So we talk a little bit about that industry average again of the 2.0. So in this question, I'm asking, why might we use an industry average? So here I'm hoping the student can, talk a little bit about what we discussed in lecture, how you might use that for benchmarks and how it could help with performance. So kind of gauging that. Then for part E, we have a list of stakeholders. So we're asking students to discuss who might be using these current ratios and why. So they have to explain that to me. And then the last question is kind of asking how, the current ratio might not be the best metric to use. And to get a response from students on this, I've explained that it's an economic downturn and the accounts receivables have not been paid in a while. So I want them to explain how this could maybe, maybe not make the ratio look that good. It's going to be manipulated somehow. So what I wanted to do next is show you the overall expert skills. So this is something that Susan taught me and was extremely helpful. And I know this slide is very overwhelming. There's a lot of information here, but so this is going to be all the skills that you would expect an expert to have on ratios. And when I saw this, I thought, oh my goodness, I'm expecting all my students to know all this information, which is impossible. They can't know all of this and they can't know how to feed this back to me in a student response. So, and it's broken out very nicely by the critical thinking model we just went over, with the exception of the content knowledge. So you have content knowledge in one column, identify in the next, analyze, and then conclude. And just think these are expert skills in each one of the areas. So content knowledge, that's something that my students are very good at. So what I've been working on is trying to move over to identify, analyze, and conclude with my students and adjusting my assignments in that way. So with that expert skill chart, I tried to select the skills that I wanted to see and then made a stage 1 chart to kind of help me form those questions for the ratio problem. So just to summarize some of the columns, so content knowledge, as I explained, this is something that my students are very good with. So finding the formulas, knowing what information to use in the formulas, and just knowing that typically current ratio is used for profitability. So in terms of identify, to summarize this, students need to know why we're using ratios, and then the external stakeholders that use them and why are ratios maybe not a perfect metric to actually use. So think of that accounts receivable example that we used in the very end of the problem. And then in terms of analyze, I want students to describe why the ratios vary across companies and why ratios vary between competitors. And then lastly, conclude. So students then have to effectively communicate this to me in writing. All right, so what I also wanted to share with you is a fraud paper. So as mentioned in my introduction, I work at Nichols College in Dudley, Massachusetts, and we have ethics in all of our business programs. So that's something that we try to incorporate in all of our courses, no matter the level. So I'm going to show you a fraud paper that I implemented in my introductory accounting course. And looking at it now, looking back on it, it's very basic. So I just required students just, write me a brief, summary, 2 pages. And what I asked them to do is find a financial statement fraud from an organization and tell me about it. So tell me about the background of the company, when the fraud took place, how are the financial statements falsified, how was it done, explain who was involved, and then tell me about the investigation. So who investigated it, how were they caught, and then lastly, this is where we get into that ethics piece. So if you were aware of any of your coworkers, as a student, if you were aware of any of your coworkers doing this, what would you do? Would you report it? Who would you report it to? So then I thought to myself, I have a lot of opportunities in this assignment to make edits and kind of build upon it. So I was thinking some of the things I could do, I could add more about ethical consequences, different types of alternatives, and then also one of the things that we cover in my introductory course would be the fraud triangle. So I was thinking, I could work motivation in there. So what I did to kind of simplify this more for my students was break it out into 4 parts. Part 1 being the majority of the previous assignment that we just looked at. So the background of the company, the fraud scheme that took place, how were the financials falsified, and then the investigation and who was involved, things like that. Then for part 2, I wanted students to expand on the financial statements, tell me what actually happened to them. So what happened to your income statement? What happened to your balance sheet? And what is the overall impact on your external stakeholders? So think about how this is going to impact some of their decisions. Then for part 3, I worked in a motivation piece. So as I mentioned, the fraud triangle. So what were the motivators? So I want to hear about that. So why did they do this? Why did they commit the fraud? And then lastly, for part 4, I'm asking students about the consequences for the individual. So what happened to the individual that committed fraud? What are some alternative actions that could have taken place by the organization? And then I asked students what they would have done if they were aware of a coworker doing this. So what would they report it to management, board of directors, go to the authorities? And then I'm going to show you how I came up with this. So again, using Susan's guidance, I decided to come up with a rubric based on everything that I wanted to see from my students. So I kind of listed this out into 4 stages. I eliminated one stage. I combined it stage 3 and 4 at the end, stage 1 being weak, stage 2 being average, and then the last column would be professional, stage 3 through 4. So what I wanted to do is just focus quickly on the middle column. The middle column is where I expect many of my students to fall. And just to give you some examples of what I expect from them, and then this is how I actually formed the questions after I was able to kind of gauge this. So I expect my students, to give me the background of the organization, tell me about the fraud scheme, but I do expect that they're going to lack some explanation on the financial statements, as in they're not going to fully be able to explain the fraud scheme that took place. Then for part 2, I wanted to know the impact on all the financial statements as a whole, but I assume that they'll only be able to tell me a few of the financial statements and perhaps only be able to tell me the impact on some of the external stakeholders, not several of them. And then for the motivation, I assume that my students, would partially explain motivations. And then lastly, for the ethical consequences, I do assume that they wouldn't be able to identify many alternatives, most likely one alternative that they could take, not all of the uncertainties. And then when they have to report this to management or board of directors, I assume they'll take a one-sided approach and only explain it from their own personal perspective and not include in other external stakeholders. All right, so I believe there's a...
Yeah, we've got a lot of people that are very interested in this assignment. They find this
Okay, they have? Oh, goodness.
So they'd like to know if you would be willing to share this assignment.
Of course, yes.
Okay, great. Well, then we
I'd
will
love
make
to.
sure that we can get the materials out to everyone following this. Thank you, Deanna. Thank you.
So the last thing I was just going to mention, so stage 2, that's how I created the assignment. That's where I expect my students to fall. As I mentioned, ethics, very big at Nichols College, so I expect them to fall in that area. Stage 3 and 4, more professional, I would assume that's when they would deliver a lot more information to me. And like I was about to mention before, I believe there's another polling question.
Again, for those of you that are waiting for the next words, we're just going to tell you that we are going to be providing copies of these slides following the event. You will get that. You will also get access to materials that are mentioned. So please be looking out for the email following the event.
Okay, I'm going to pick up where Deanna left off. I actually asked my students to address an assignment similar, a little different, in an introductory financial accounting course. And what I discovered was, let me back up. So what I did was, this was back when the WorldCom fraud, and I don't know if everybody remembers the fraud that was involved there, but it had to do with inappropriately capitalizing some costs that should have been expensed. Okay, so the company had recorded them correctly, and then they made some adjusting entries to capitalize things they shouldn't have. And so it was a really nice fraud from an introductory accounting standpoint because it's basic accounting entries. And so what I did was I had my students read the SEC report regarding that fraud, and I asked them to address 3 things. The first was what appeared to be the motivation, and in this particular case, I wasn't teaching the fraud triangle, but the SEC report went into some detail on the motivation, so basically they could find that information in the report. And then I asked them to explain the accounting, which is similar to part of the assignment that Deanna used, which, how did this improper capitalization, affect the financial statements? And then part 3, I went kind of posed them in the place of, you're working in this company and you became aware of the fraud, what would you do? I'm only going to show you a couple of responses to part 3 because that's the one that has the real critical thinking in it. And I want you to notice at the very end of the requirement that I told students that this part of the assignment should be 1 to 2 pages single spaced. And so the first thing you'll notice is here's a very short 2-sentence paragraph from a student at stage 1. And before well, no, let me read this and then I'm going to comment. If I was an employee in that company, I would call attention of the board of directors to such incident, and I would advise them to make an investigation on the subject matter since the board of directors had a final say in management of the company. It is better to make board of directors to aware of what was going on in the company and to let them take a legal action of that matter. So remember, this is a student at stage 1. They think there's only one answer. And what they saw when they read the SEC report was that once the fraud became known, the board of directors sort of took over and took action and got, fired some managers and, so on. And so basically the student is taking their clues from the SEC report and they believe, the board of directors has to be the correct answer here. There's really only one answer. And so the fact that the student only wrote 2 sentences in some ways can be misleading. What I have found in my interactions with students over time is the stage 1 student spends an awful lot of time and energy trying to find the single correct answer and trying to figure out what that is. The fact that the student only wrote 2 sentences when the assignment clearly called for more than that really does not necessarily mean that they didn't put work into it. And I think that's one of the hard things for us to understand as faculty. When we see this very, very short response, we might incorrectly assume that the student didn't devote much time and energy, and that may or may not be true. You can't really tell from the length of the response. I wanted to also share with you a response from stage 2. There are 3 major actions one can take after finding out about the fraud in the company. First, one can act passive, pretend nothing ever happened, and let the fraud continue. And they put in parentheses, committing a crime at the same time, question mark. Second, one can actually join the bad guys and commit even bigger crime. The third option is to blow the whistle and be honest. Most of us would probably want to be honest, but the company may be prepared to put pressure on people to keep them quiet. Even peer pressure can be enough pressure to ensure employee loyalty. Not to mention maybe the most powerful tool, money. Nobody wants to risk their job and future incomes. I wouldn't. The easiest and best way to deal with a fraud is to try to get away from it. I would try to sneak out of the company and find another job. After making sure I have another job, I could disclose the fraud. So I often have trouble when I'm reading a stage 2 student's response. They'll say some things that tend to suggest fairly a good amount of sophistication. I mean, they have 3 different alternative actions here, which is good. They recognize that there could be pressure on your behavior and so on. But when you look at their conclusion, they basically kind of say, well, what would I do? And why would I do that? In other words, the solution kind of falls down to this bias jumper kind of solution. And maybe that's perfectly fine. I mean, this is an ethical scenario and there's no one, a universally appropriate response. But to me, this comes across as a little bit of critical thinking, a recognition that there are, in fact, multiple viewpoints, but here's me and this is what I would do. And it kind of falls back to that personal opinion piece. And I should point out that when I used this assignment with my students, I had some students at stages 3 and 4, a small number of papers, and they wrote wonderful analyses, applying all of the critical thinking skills and looking through the pros and cons and so on. So in other words, even in an introductory course, you may have the majority of your students at stage 1 and 2, but there will be some students at those higher stages. So let's talk a little bit more about stage 2. As Deanna mentioned in her introductory course, she thinks most of her students would be at stage 2. And I have seen that off and on in introductory courses, particularly when I teach non-traditional age undergraduate students. Older students tend to be more likely at stage 2, although when they come into an accounting classroom, even if they're at stage 2 elsewhere, they might revert back to stage 1. It's kind of, you have to sort of figure out how they're responding to your course. But at stage 2, the learning objectives up at the top is, delaying judgment until you've completed thorough analysis. That's really, really, really hard for people at this stage. And that means you may need to recognize that you have biases. And you'll notice in that stage 2 paper that I just read, the students seem to say, oh yeah, some people would do this, or wouldn't do this, I wouldn't, kind of thing. In other words, they're sort of recognizing that there could be some biases involved, but they're not necessarily trying to control those biases and sort of think about how biases might interfere with good ethical reasoning. And then finally, looking at a problem from multiple viewpoints. So my biggest challenge with students at stage 2 is to get them to do more thorough pros and cons and to delay their judgment. That's the big key with these students. Down at the bottom of the slide, you can see that you can give these students a little bit more complexity than the stage 1. You still need to keep it at a fairly low, moderate level because they can be overwhelmed, but you can make it just a little bit more sophisticated in terms of the nature of the problem. So now let's turn it back over to Deanna.
All right, so what I did for one of my examples or one of my assignments would be depreciation. And at the introductory level, I usually just do straight line depreciation, and I usually don't incorporate in salvage value, so just keep that in mind. Also, please note, one of my guilty pleasures is to put my last name into the example problems too, so you'll notice it says Foster Company. I always say I'm not very creative, so that's one of the reasons why I do that. So in this example, we have an organization that just purchased a brand new piece of equipment for $20,000, and this was on January 1st, 2018, and the useful life was for 5 years. Then 2 years later, there's some uncertainties regarding how often they're going to use this equipment. They're not even sure if they're going to use it anymore. And then as a result, the useful life 2 years later has changed to 6 years. So for my first question that I asked students, I'm just asking them to calculate the depreciation and then record the adjusting journal entry at year end as of year end 2018. So I'm just seeing if they can do the calculation, if they can pull the correct information from the problem. And then for part B, I'm basically asking them to do the same thing, but 2 years later with the change in the useful life. So they have to know how to do the calculation for that with the new useful life. And then again, record the adjusting journal entry at year end for 2020. And then for the last question that I asked them, how is the change in useful life going to impact the future financial statements? And just to let you know some of the responses I usually get, especially if the useful life increases, usually the students tell me, assets go up, earnings go up. So very vague, really no explanation there. And again, that's because I need to break down my problems more and try to get more information from my students. So as I mentioned before, you think of the ideal response that you want from your students, and you just break it down into simple questions to get your students there. So I used the same exact question. I didn't really have to make any adjustments for that, so same scenario. However, this time for the first question, I asked students, ignoring the actual first paragraph, how would you estimate the useful life for an asset? So I want them to discuss some of the things we talked about in lecture, like maybe what type of equipment it is, how much they're actually using it, what are some of the environmental conditions, so along those lines. And then for B, I'm asking them if there's some type of uncertainty about the continued use of the equipment, what could happen to the useful life or the equipment. So the useful life, it could change in estimate, or maybe there's something wrong with the equipment, we'd have to do an impairment, or maybe it's obsolete. So some type of discussion along those lines. And then I have used the calculation problems again. So I asked them to calculate depreciation using that straight line method again at year end, December 31st, 2018, create the journal entry. Then same thing for part E. I'm asking them to do the calculation, but for 2 years later with the new useful life. So they have to know what information to pull. And then they have to create the adjusting journal entry for the end of 2020. And then for part F, I'm asking the students, you know, what actually happens to that total amount of depreciation when you change that useful life? So does that depreciation, does the total amount actually change? And I want them to explain to me that it doesn't. So that's part F. Then for part G, I'm asking if there's going to be any changes in the previous financial statements. So from 2018 and 2019, before the useful life changed. And I want them to explain to me why they don't change. And then for the last part, H, I'm asking them to explain the future financial statements. So financial statements after the change in useful life. So after 2020, do those financial statements change and why? And what I wanted to show you next is kind of how I came up with this problem. So as I mentioned before, my students are typically very good with the content knowledge, so that's very basic. And just to summarize, they have to know what formula to use, what information to pull. They have to know how to create the adjusting journal entry at year end, so adjusting journal entries, explaining the useful life, where that comes from for straight line depreciation. So that's just a summary of the content knowledge. And then for identify, what I'm looking for my students to do is explain the estimated useful life and how it can often be uncertain. Identify the external stakeholders that might be interested in the depreciation and factors that might cause estimated useful life to differ across companies. And then when we get over to analyze, with that problem, I'm expecting my students to analyze how changes in accounting assumptions, you know, impact the financial statements, and explain why there might be some disagreements about the useful life for an asset. And then lastly, they would just have to be able to conclude, so be able to come up with these written responses and submit them in an assignment.
Okay, I'm going to share with you a different example. We wanted to address both introductory financial and introductory management accounting, and so I'm going to share with you a relevant costing problem. And I should point out that this is actually a problem adapted from my cost accounting textbook, which of course is a higher level course. However, this is a problem in chapter 1, and my purpose in including this particular problem in chapter 1 was to allow the students an opportunity to, number one, refresh their memory of some of what they learned in the management accounting class, but I also wanted to relate it to their personal lives. I mean, one of the problems students have in introductory courses especially is they don't really understand the business context. A lot of them really don't have any business experience, and so I intentionally wrote this to be a decision that any student could understand. You know, it's like, am I going to live in the residence hall, or am I going to live in an apartment with some friends? And I want them to think of this both in terms of quantitative information and qualitative information. So I've basically just given all this information with some estimates thrown in. This is the way, you know, a lot of people would simply write the question would be just part A. You know, if Janet asks for your advice, you know, give her a memo with your recommendation. And what we would expect the students to do then is to compare the expected costs on the two alternatives, maybe throw in a few qualitative, you know, you might prefer living with your friends, or you might prefer the lifestyle in the residence hall, whatever. But students could probably do, you know, they could come up with a response here. I personally like to add a part B to this requirement. And this is something I've been doing in recent years that I find really helpful for me in understanding more about the thinking that's actually going on inside my students' heads. So I have them write the memo. That's the first part. And then part B is, how did you decide what information? You know, write 1 or 2 paragraphs explaining your thought process. In other words, I want them to explain to me how they decided what was important to include in their memo. And I worded it that way because it turns out that asking students how they decided what to include will give you clues about what their thinking was. And let me just, I've got some notes down here at the bottom. Because students at stage 1 really are confused by anything having to do with their judgment, you know, if it's not just based on cost, what can I possibly do? They aren't going to have much to say in part B. In other words, they're going to sound confused there just like they sound confused in the first part. Students at stage 2, and this is one of the ways you can figure out that a student's at stage 2, they tend to just repeat themselves, you know, so you'll get a response to part B that'll say something, well, in the memo, this is what I thought, so that's what I said. You know, it's kind of, they tell you, in effect, they tell you that they were being a biased jumper. They don't use that language, but they tell you, in essence, that they just had written to Janet what they thought. And then what I have seen is students who are at stage 3 and 4 can actually provide fairly sophisticated responses to part B here. And that's how you know for sure that those students are actually operating at a higher level. Because sometimes a student, particularly a student at stage 2 with good written communication skills, may come across as a strong critical thinker. But what I found is that this version of the assignment helps me figure out who actually was applying critical thinking and who was not. There's another thing, so this is kind of the basic assignment. One of the things I've been doing in recent years is to add to an assignment requirements that I might or might not require the students to turn in. And, but at a minimum, these are things that I would ask the students to think about and to be prepared to discuss in class. And the first one is, you know, okay, using only the cost information, you know, list all the costs, you know, and, you know, some of the costs might apply to one option versus the other. Some might be in both places, things like, you know, tuition isn't going to change and so on. And then I have them figure out what's relevant versus irrelevant. And that's a key skill. Students at stage 1 don't understand the idea of there being some information is relevant and some is irrelevant. And in fact, they often get annoyed when we give them information that's irrelevant. They think we're playing games with them. And what they need to understand is that a key part of being a good accountant in the workplace is being able to figure out what's relevant, what's not relevant, and they need practice with that. And so then I have them calculate the cost piece, and then given this cost comparison, which recommendation, you know, given just the costs. And then part 2, I have them move into uncertainties. And this is a fairly extensive uncertainty question. And if your students have never dealt with uncertainties before, they might need a lot of work on it. So for each of the costs, you know, is that cost likely known for sure, or estimated with a little uncertainty, or estimated with moderate or high uncertainty? So you're kind of getting into degrees of, we know this one, that one, we have really no idea how much money we're going to spend on food if we go to the apartment. And then, you know, and then there's something in the middle. So that way we can, again, go through and explain, you know, part C here, explain why the cost cannot be known for sure. And then a couple of additional things. Then I'm leading the students into this idea of maybe information that wasn't given to you in the problem could be important. And part A is maybe there's some costs that Janet didn't identify when she was putting together her estimates. And then there could be factors other than costs that matter, like, you know, uncertainties could be important. If Janet has a tight budget and she doesn't know for sure what her costs are going to be in the apartment, maybe that's a big deal to her. or maybe it's not a big deal, you know. So that's the kind of thing that I would want the students to be able to address. And that's one of the reasons why I made this a student housing decision, because I assume the students could all understand that decision fairly well. And then part 4 is kind of getting into this whole thing, well, wait a minute, if these qualitative factors are what end up mattering, then what's the point of doing a cost comparison, you know? And so I'm basically trying to bring them back to management accounting, say, well, you know, even though estimated costs aren't the only thing that might impact a decision, it's still useful information, assuming it's relevant and all of that. And so basically this is a way of kind of in a less confusing way for students to kind of walk them through. So these 4 parts on this slide and the previous one are ones you could just say, you know, look at this and think about all of this and then write your memo to Janet. In other words, you don't have to have them turn in their answers to all of these questions, but these could be good topics for them to think about. Or if you'd rather do this in class exercises, put the students in groups and have them go through each of these 4 parts, I think that would be either a live groups or online groups should work pretty well, because different students are going to have different ideas and they'll be able to share them. So let me just briefly comment that we have these resources, as Steve mentioned earlier, are available on the AICPA's website, and here is the link. So we have this critical thinking guide, and you see the cover of it there on the right-hand side of your screen, and that guide can be downloaded, and it has a lot of information about these different stages of thinking and more ideas in terms of teaching and learning activities. But we hope that today we've been able to give you some ideas there. By the way, the 5th polling question is here. So go ahead and answer that. And then we're going to follow it up very quickly with the last and 6th polling question. So go ahead and answer that one as quickly as you can. And I put my email address on this slide because if any of you ever want to engage in conversations with me, you know, maybe like Deanna, maybe you've been working on designing some assignments and you'd like some feedback or whatever, you know, I'm more than happy to engage in conversations and discussions and whatever I can do. My big goal is to help improve the critical thinking of accountants, which is a key issue that we all struggle with. So let me go ahead. I think we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Steve to ask questions.
Okay, thanks, Susan. And just as a reminder, we're waiting for the 6th and final polling question to launch here in just a moment. So please answer that. For those of you, I know we've seen quite a few comments about people not seeing the questions. Again, I just want to make a note that Anna is going to be sending out a Word document to all attendees following this so that you can record your answers for CPE. So please watch for that. So Susan, there's been a couple of questions that have come through and I've been able to answer that. But one of the questions that came through, I think really tees up something nicely, that we did say this is a 3-part series, right? And so someone was asking, how do we do this in my graduate courses and more advanced courses, and specifically ethics, which is really kind of telling. That's exactly where our thinking was.
Yep.
So for those of you that have enjoyed the series and that are getting a lot out of it, we're so grateful for you to be here. And the 3rd installment of this will actually be taking place on Friday, October 30th. So you will be getting a save the date after this. So please keep in mind that we will have one additional a webinar on this newly launched resource from Susan and the AICPA. So we're excited about that.
Yeah, so because people had asked about the graduate level classes and the ethics, like Steve said, that's going to be the big topic for the next webinar. I have done a lot of this at both the undergraduate and the master's level. So that's one, I probably have way more examples at the ethics and master's level than I do at the introductory level. So that should work out. Also, we're working on an idea that we would maybe be able to develop a guide for students. And I just, that may be coming down the road, but we'll keep you informed as more information is available. I'm looking here at the responses to the last polling questions, and people have questions. Which of these learning objectives is most important? Oh, I think we got confused and put that one back. Okay, never mind. We already talked about this. Okay, let's go on. Steve, did you have another question for us?
Yes, I did. I actually did have a question for you here. So someone wants to know, what can university, this is a broad question, all right? So very broad. And they want to know, like, what you believe universities can do at the front end to prevent students from still being in stage 1. Download the guide.
This has been an ongoing frustration for me since I first learned about the fact that we can be more deliberate in how we help students develop their thinking skills. I did a major study of about 200 students in Canada as part of CPA Canada's, this is before they had the merger, so it was back in the days of the chartered accountants in Canada. And we took 200 students selected randomly out of their pre-certification program, and we assessed their critical thinking level. So these are all students who had completed an undergraduate degree in accounting and were just starting in an online program that was going to prepare them then ultimately to take the uniform exam. And so I was disappointed that that the data came out looking like what I've seen in the US. In other words, about 25% of the students were coming in at stage 1. I think about 60% or so were at stage 2, and then there were students up at the higher stages, but it was dominated definitely by stages 1 and 2. I don't think that, one of the things I hear people in liberal arts say all the time, faculty in those disciplines will say, well, you need to send your students over to our programs because we teach critical thinking. I have 2 responses to that. Number one, research has shown that liberal arts graduates do not graduate with stronger, on average, critical thinking than business school students. There are some degree programs in some universities that do have higher than other degree programs in other universities. But on average, if you look at data across a lot of schools and a lot of programs, there is no real evidence suggesting that different degrees do a better job at this than others. And that's disappointing. The other thing is, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that people learn these skills best within a domain. So if we're trying to train accountants to be good critical thinkers, they need to learn critical thinking in the context of accounting. The likelihood that they can take what they learned in a liberal arts class and then come over to a business scenario and apply it, in general, people who are operating at very high levels of cognitive development are more able to transfer those skills. But because most of our students are not operating at those high levels, they don't have the ability to translate it. And on top of that, they have preconceived notions that can interfere. And I think accounting, we struggle with that a lot in introductory courses where students think, oh, this is a numbers course, 1 + 1 = 2, that's all I'm gonna learn how to do here. And so the students' preconceived ideas interfere with their critical thinking and accounting. And that's why we need to address at least some critical thinking, especially uncertainties in introductory accounting, so that students don't leave introductory courses with that mistaken belief about what accounting is. I don't know, Deanna, if you have additional thoughts.
No, I agree with that perfectly.
Okay.
So someone asked this question. This came through just a few seconds ago. They want to know, do accountants tend to have a habit of mind that impacts their critical thinking steps?
Everybody has a habit of mind that affects their critical thinking step. I believe mindset is a huge piece, but there are different parts to that mindset. So one of the critical thinking model, you'll notice that we put in the guide, sort of speaks to accounting. There's a mindset in accounting of skepticism, due care, objectivity. The students can recite those words and define them, but I don't think they really understand them very well. In other words, you have to have pretty strong critical thinking before the true meaning of those mindsets start to make sense. So, I think this is where we get, again, I think by helping our students do more than just memorize the codes in accounting and memorizing the terminology out of the textbook, I think they need more practice applying these ideas. And the more we can put the terminology that applies to our discipline, I think the more we can kind of build some of that into our assignments, so they're starting to be exposed to these words being applied in realistic scenarios. Like I used to teach auditing and, skepticism. Well, we can point to all kinds of fraud failure or accounting audit failures that related to auditors not being sufficiently skeptical. So we need more stories about that. We need more. The students need more practice recognizing these things. The mindset matters a lot, but what we can do is we can influence that mindset by trying to help our students recognize, what does it mean to have the mindset of an accountant?
Okay, great. Deanna, something came through for you, a specific question. They want to know, and this process obviously is new to you, so they want to know if you could just talk a little bit about your process in developing your assignments and editing them from the usual assignments to those that are incorporating critical thinking.
Sure. So I was going to say, I was thinking about, so I have my old assignments that I have been working on and editing, and I would think of, the ideal response that I would want to see from these students. So probably like one of the best responses from my students, and then going through and just breaking it down. And what also helped me is to think of, so Susan's chart where she had all the, I believe it was expert, we labeled it as expert skills. So thinking of also expert skills that you would want to see from your students on a specific topic area, and then kind of pulling those out and then using those to kind of create your questions. And again, being very specific with the questions, because you're kind of leading them, on that critical thinking path to, have them, do more analysis and, go through uncertainties and things like that.
All right, so here's another one. Have either of you experienced integrity issues in the student responses, high, medium, low? And they're saying, I assume you use Turnitin?
Yeah, in fact, I'm in the middle of an issue right now. I taught a course last February, March in India, MBA students, and they took because the school closed down and they sent everybody home, the students ended up taking their final exams from home. And we had some serious copying and there was only one, we found some copying from some sources using Turnitin, but there was one paper where almost like 90% of the responses were copied purely from one student's paper to the other. And when I contacted the students about this, each of them separately told me that the one student and his family were all ill with the virus, and they were in the ICU, and this other student basically just helped them out by, you know, giving them the answers, and you know, you can understand that, you know, but obviously it's a serious breach, and so I was in contact with the university's you know, ethics people, and I proposed to them, because of the unusual nature of what happened, that I'm going to do a separate oral examination with the two students who had the copying. And but I would not normally be that accommodating. It's the unusual nature of what happened this year. I'm being a little bit nicer than I normally would be. Deanna, I don't know if you've had some issues.
I haven't. I've been teaching for a total of 7 years now. I was at a previous institution before, and we used Turnitin at both institutions, and I've never had an issue, but I have other colleagues that have had issues. And there's usually a council of faculty that's like a little ethics commission, and they have to review the cases and then decide what the punishment would be. And it was like that at both institutions, but I've never had to go through it. So I consider myself lucky, but I assume it's going to happen eventually, probably soon, knowing that we're using Zoom more for classes and things like that. So I'm prepared for it, but haven't seen anything yet.
One of my solutions, it's not a perfect solution, but I think it helps reduce some of the problems, is I always write my final exams from scratch. So the students cannot go on the internet and find answers that somebody, so if anybody's copying anybody, it's going to be within the classroom. And so I actually spend a lot of time writing new caselets with questions because I don't want to reuse exams.
Susan, I was just going to say I do the same thing, and I let my students know too that all my exams and homework I make, you know, fresh from scratch. Mm-hmm. I try to do it each year just to have differing information in it, just so it's harder for them to kind of cheat. And then if I use questions from the textbooks too, I also change the information just to make it a little bit harder.
Yep. Yep.
So this is a question that's come through on the chat and in the Q&A, and was touched on a little earlier, but maybe we could revisit it for the folks that want to have more information on this. So can you explain the importance of the rubrics for the assignments and how they can help set expectations for students and hopefully drive better results?
Do you want to talk about that, Deanna?
So before this process, I used rubrics just so students knew like exactly what they had to do for their grade and the information that they had to, you know, put into an assignment. But throughout this whole process, I've used rubrics a little bit differently. I found myself, you know, setting up rubrics first with the information I wanted to see, and then using that to make problems, just to, you know, break down the problems. But I think it's great for students. I know my students love rubrics. I do joke with them and say that's so they can do the bare minimum, but that's a little joke that I have with them. I do tease them a little bit sometimes, but so they do, and they know exactly what to do, what the expectations are, what I'm looking for grading, and what they have to do to get a high grade. So I love rubrics.
Yeah, I believe in rubrics as well. In my mind, there are kind of two different ways to use rubrics. One is to have a rubric that's designed for a particular assignment, which we showed you one example of that. And then there's what I call a generic rubric in the faculty guide on the website. And I've done both in different classrooms depending on the situation. If I have a course where I am collecting multiple written assignments that all require critical thinking, I prefer to use a generic rubric for each of the assignments. And the reason is I want the students to see that it's not, these skills are not unique to this case. In other words, I want you to learn how to think through problems. But when students are first starting out, and especially in introductory courses, I think that may be a little bit too advanced for them, especially if they're at stage 1. So a more specific rubric that's designed that includes the information for the assignment could be more valuable. But you want to shift the students' thinking from I'm being graded on this assignment to I'm trying to develop these skills. And the faster you can get the students into that second mindset, I think the better, but you may need to start with assignment specific.
So Susan, we've already got some requests here about putting some of this about ethics, so rubrics around ethics and some of the assessment tools and things. So we'll make sure I capture this.
Yeah, so we'll definitely have that. I've actually done a lot of work with ethics, so I have tons of examples. And in fact, my cost accounting book has, you know, a little case in every chapter, you know, and so I started with that, and then I started, you know, every course I teach includes ethics problems, and I've just been doing this a long time. So yeah, the third webinar will definitely have that in there.
Okay, great. And with that, that is all the questions that we have open for today.
Okay, well, we went fast today. We must have been talking fast. Who knows? I always have trouble anticipating how many questions there will be. I want to just add a couple kind of summary comments here. Deanna mentioned earlier that she had attended the previous webinar, and then she and I kind of worked together on her examples. She revised some assignments, and then I gave her some suggestions and feedback. And that's exactly the process that I personally went through when I first learned about this back in the 1990s. The more I learned about student thinking and these patterns of thinking, these stages, the more I started recognizing what was working well and what was not working well with the assignments that I was using. And what I discovered was that some of the assignments that the students didn't do very well on, you know, it's kind of like Deanna was saying, I went back and looked at it and went, oh, no wonder the students couldn't do well on that. Either I was asking them to do things that were way too high level for their stage, or I was wording it in too vague a way, and I had expectations that they would understand things that they wouldn't. And so I started realizing that I could redesign my assignments, recraft them, and be much more effective. And the other big challenge I think that faculty have is they want their students to be at a higher stage than the students actually are. And so there's kind of a tendency to want to design the assignments at this higher level because, by golly, that's where students should be when they come to my class. I take the different approach. My approach is, they come to my class in some fashion, and it's my job to deal with what comes into my classroom. And so if they're at stage 1, that means I need to deal with them at stage 1. And if they're at stage 2, I need to deal with them at stage 2. I think that by shooting over the heads of our students is probably one of the biggest reasons that we don't see more development of critical thinking in our degree programs. I think too many faculty are going high, and then the students they're not developing any new skills. They're just, especially they get into that biased jumper mode of thinking, and they just stay there because it's a very comfortable place to be. I can think whatever I want. Here's my opinion. Here's why I have my opinion. It's a comfortable place for our students to live. It's kind of an emotional piece there. And we need to get our students out of that comfort zone. For example, one of the things that I do is I place very low grade weight on the conclusion for students at stage 2. Yeah, they may have to give me a conclusion, but that's not what I'm paying attention to. I'm paying attention to the thoroughness of the analysis, and that's where most of the grade weight is going to be. So I kind of use the carrot and the stick, you know. The students know to get a good grade on the case in my class, they have to do the thorough analysis. Jumping to a conclusion is not going to get them the grade. That's the hardest thing for students at stage 2. Any additional thoughts, Deanna?
No, I was just going to agree with exactly what you said. I was making my questions way too vague, and I expected so much from my students, and they were not, you know, giving me what I wanted. And I thought it was them, but I take full responsibility for it. It was me. Just needed to be more specific and break out those problems to kind of lead them to that critical thinking and analysis path. So I've learned so much through this whole process and how to make my exams and my assignments better.
Susan, I know that this question just came in, and I know you addressed this in the first webinar to some extent, but someone wants to know, like, how can you tell what your students, what level your students are like ahead of time, beforehand?
Okay, in the faculty guide, one of the suggestions in there is to take, and this is probably the simplest, easiest, least painful way. And that is, like, you've been talking about some topic during class, you know, depreciation, what's the estimated useful life, ratio analysis, how do we make sense of, you know, something. And then at the end of class, just have the students take out a piece of paper and write a paragraph explaining why something is uncertain. Like, you know, why can't we know for sure what the estimated useful life is for an asset? And you know, why don't we have just, you know, why isn't it always true that a higher current ratio is always better? You know, or something. And it doesn't have to be a complicated question. In fact, the simpler the question, the better. And what I do is I take those responses and I sort them into 3 stacks. So even if you have, you know, 200 students in your classroom, you can do this. And the first stack is they didn't have any idea what the question was. You know, they wrote something down, it didn't make any sense. And then the second stack is they had at least one valid idea there that tied in with the question. And then the third stack is, yeah, they actually had a pretty good handle on the question, on the response to the question. And that gives you a very crude and very quick estimate of the stages, stage 1, stage 2, and 3 or more. And I find that to be the least painful way to do the assessments. Now, if I'm doing a research study, like the project I did with the Canadians, where we had 200 students and we wanted good data, then we had to carefully craft an assignment to you know, where the assignment called for greater critical thinking, but we didn't guide them too much because you don't want to tell them everything. You know, you want to, we were trying to get a sense of what their current thinking was when they came into this program. And we, each student's paper was rated using a general rubric for cognitive development, and it was rated by 2 people, and if their ratings differed, then they had to reconcile the differences. I mean, you know, it was very costly, and it's the same kind of assessments I've done in my own classrooms with rubrics. I've been trained, the underlying model that I use is the reflective judgment model of cognitive development, and I actually attended a week-long training course, rater training. And after that week-long training, I became much better and faster at being able to recognize the students' patterns of thinking. But these rubrics that are in the guide, because they're based on these patterns of thinking, I believe that most people can learn to get better at this over time. But that example that I showed you, the Janet Baker Residence Hall, where I had part A write the memo to Janet, and then part B, you know, explain how you decided what to be included. That is another fairly easy, not too difficult way of getting more information about the students' thinking, which will improve your ability to identify what stage they're at. So that's why I like that design.
Okay. Here's an interesting question that just came through, and I know it ties back to this cognitive development that you addressed earlier, Susan, but someone says, I teach traditional age and non-traditional older students. Should I expect the older, more experienced students to be better critical thinkers?
Yeah, but not by as much as you would think. What I have found in general is that my non-traditional age students are at stage 2, you know. And I assume we're talking about introductory courses here. It may differ when you get to higher level courses in the program. But I have found that even I've taught more MBA courses than undergraduate courses throughout my career. And believe it or not, even MBA students in, you know, they're operating at the same level. They come into an accounting class roughly at stage 2 with a few of them at stage, you know, I'll have maybe 15% of the MBAs at stage 1, which is kind of hard to imagine, you know, but I think part of that is the mindset. So that's one of the reasons why, as early in the course as possible, I try to give my students a task that requires critical thinking. And Deanna's idea of introducing the critical thinking model at the beginning, you know, first day of class, you're trying to change their mindset. You're trying to say, this is not a course where all you do is crank out some numbers and some journal entries and you're done. This course is more than that.
So it's interesting because someone actually just asked that question. Do you have a day 1 or day 2 assignment that you do with the students to break the misconception that the course is just about math?
Yeah, it's easier to do in management accounting than it is in financial accounting, because with financial accounting, the students, you know, often need to get a little bit of, you know, basic accounting under their belt. But maybe Deanna has some ideas on that I haven't come up with.
In terms of a day 1 or day 2 assignment, I haven't really put too much thought into it yet. I had mentioned usually my day 1 in financial, I do icebreaker activities just so I can learn everyone's names and go over the text and syllabus. So I haven't come up with a day 2 assignment, but I plan on it, and I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but it's definitely something that I'll probably be doing over the next couple days.
You know, there was a case I used to use in an executive MBA program ages and ages and ages ago. And I can't remember the name of it, but it was a really simple little case where you had, like in ancient times, people traded things as opposed to using money. And you had to, the students had to figure out like how many assets somebody had. I should try to find, dig up the information on that case. It was really good because it required the students to deal with accounting without being taught yet what accounting is. And it was good because they had to think out of the box. You know, it was a way of getting them to kind of create what they think makes sense in terms of like how much money how much did someone earn? Well, 3 calves and a pile of hay or something. I mean, it was kind of goofy, but it was actually, I thought it was kind of effective in getting the students' minds open to accounting. But it's been a long time since I used that case. I don't remember what the name of it was.
To look that up. I have one more question here. They're coming in, and I apologize, there's some noise outside if you're starting to hear that. But someone says, I teach at the community college, and I struggle with the fact that some of my students feel that questions should be based on everything that was said or in the textbook. Right. It is based on many of their other courses that are straight out of the textbook.
I don't know if you want to respond to that, Deanna?
I've found that in other courses that I've taught, that students think it should just, the questions you ask should just be like what you've covered in class, and there shouldn't be any like critical thinking or analysis. In my higher level classes, I do a lot of case study analysis, and they always say, but we don't do these things in class. But I tell them it's because I'm trying to build their skills so they can work in the accounting industry. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Susan, but I do try to tell them, you're going to have to do this someday. So, let's learn how to do it now.
I think one of the ways, because we're trying to change, again, their mindset. And they have had lots of classes where all they had to do was memorize out of the textbook and the class notes. I think the biggest motivation ought to be, why do you want to become an accountant? Do you want a job in accounting? Do you want to be successful in the profession of accounting? And this is what the profession is saying. The profession is saying students entering the workforce do not have adequate critical thinking skills. And, you know, it may not be persuasive to them, but, and this is one of the things that I've found in dealing with stage 2 students, the bias jumpers. They don't want to change what they're doing. They really don't want to change. You know, so there are things that I just have to say, here's why, and we're doing it. And if you don't go with me on this, you're going to end up with a bad grade, you know. And I basically, you know, coerce them in a supportive way into going where I want them to go. But I think the biggest argument is the workplace. The workplace demands it.
So this is interesting. One of our attendees threw out that the case you might be talking about is called the sheep herders, and the unit of currency was sheep.
It might be.
So follow up on that.
All
right, that's great. Okay, well, I want to thank all of you for attending the webinar today. For those of you that did have some questions that were unanswered, we will be going through and reviewing any unanswered questions to address them. Following the webinar, as I said, you will be receiving copies of the slides. You will also receive a link to the recording of this session, and then also to all of the resources as well. Please watch for that Word document that has the information regarding the polling questions so that you can get your CPE. And again, the next web event will be held live on Friday, February 30th. So October, sorry. What did I say?
February.
Friday, October 30th. So we look forward to seeing you all there. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please reach out to us, and please do go to this place on This Way to CPA that has the critical thinking resources. There is tremendous things there that support the work that Susan has done. I want to thank Deanna so much for all the work that she did in preparing for today. It was terrific. And Susan, as always, it was a pleasure to be with you. So thank all of you for helping us today. Anna, for all of your work, and everyone else. Have a great afternoon. Thank you so much for joining.